Hello and welcome to the Alpha Anywhere demo and Q&A webcast. I'm Dave McCormick, VP of Product Management here at Alpha Software, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Sarah Mitchell, our Director of Customer Success, also our Head of Documentation. Today, Sarah is going to continue her discussion on building out API web services, and today she's going to focus on authenticating those web services. But we're also here to answer your questions. You could type those questions into the questions box of the GoToWebinar control panel. Also, keep in mind, you can always send emails to guides, GUIDES @alphasoftware.com. Hello, Sarah, are you there?
I am here. Are you there?
I am, yes. Can you tell?
Yeah,
Don't
I
do
can
that
tell.
to me. It's the Ides of March. I always get thrown off around this time.
That was yesterday.
I told you I always get thrown off around this time. Exactly. You're
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So yeah, welcome everybody. I know if you attended last week, we may have said that we were going to do Android Cordova CLI build part 2 this week. However, the development team has been working on a few updates for the next release regarding that, and I am putting off part 2 of that presentation until next week because there are some changes I'd like to talk about. So today we're going to return to a topic that we started last year and had a presentation on this back in December, and I had every intention of getting back to this sooner, but we're going to be talking about adding authentication to your own APIs built within Alpha Anywhere. But before we get to that, just a reminder that DevCon 2022 is coming October 18th, 2022 through the 21st. If you haven't registered yet, please join us. We'd love to see you there. We have lots of exciting content coming down the line for that. And you can do that by going to our website here, which you can't read because it's white on white, but it does say www.alphasoftware.com/devcon2022. And if Dave could post that link in the chat for you folks, that would be helpful too.
I sure can.
So yeah, we're gonna do API authentication part 2, and it's been a while since we talked about this, and all my plans to talk about these big huge topics tends to be more content than I initially anticipated setting these things up. So this is part 2. If you weren't here in December, then or you haven't seen this on YouTube, then we're gonna do a little bit of recap about what authentication is, and all authentication really is proving an assertion that someone has access, is allowed to access something like a resource that you are providing. And an example of an authentication would be like logging in with your username and password, and then two-factor authentication piece proving who you are. That's really what authentication is. It's not. It's part of another thing called authorization. So authentication, proving you are who you are and have access for something. Authorization is checking what you're allowed to access when you go to request those resources. So why would you want to authenticate your APIs? Well, for starters, you can limit who can access it. You can limit what they can access within your API. You can impose rate limiting. So if you don't want someone to be able to make thousands of calls per second on your API, you can use authentication to prevent that from happening. You can also audit who's been using your API. These are all reasons you might want to have it. There are others, but things to think about if you want to provide a web service for people to access part of the application you've built or maybe data you've stored. In terms of authentication methods, there are several different types out there. These are actually four types. There's basic or bearer authentication. Basic authentication is you pass in your username and password, just straight up base64 encoded in the header to the API when you make a request. And then the API decodes that, checks it, and says, yep, you are who you are. Here's your data or whatever you requested. Bearer is kind of similar. It's just a simple token you pass in. There's also API keys, which seem like to be something similar to bearer authentication tokens, but can be very different depending on how you've implemented them and how you use them. And then OAuth, specifically OAuth 2, is a more complex method of verifying somebody is who they are and getting a token from that authorization process, which is then passed in on requests that you then use to verify again, like, is this token real? Is this person who claims that they have access to my API, are they real? Do they have that access? And at some point in the future, in a part 3, we're gonna look at OAuth 2 in more detail, because that's a wider discussion. It doesn't just apply to your API keys, but there's some other ways you can use it within Alpha Anywhere. And if you've heard about JWT, JSON Web Tokens, that's something that is used in some of those flows.
In OAuth, you mean?
In OAuth flows, yes,
Okay.
yeah. And the other key thing with OAuth is that your tokens expire. You have to request a new one at some point, thus continuously proving you have access to something.
Mhm.
We're going to look at API key authentication today. API key authentication is simply the request comes in with an API key that you've given to the user. That key is provided in all requests, typically in the header. And that key also proves that they are allowed to access the resource that you've granted access to. In terms of generating, before I move on, we haven't really talked about this, but with API key generation, there are a bunch of different ways to do it. The simplest method, which we're going to use, is just generating a GUID, and that's going to be the key. But I wanted to point out that there are caveats with using GUIDs. Not every GUID generation algorithm out there is guaranteed to be random. So something to keep in mind if you don't want someone to guess the API keys. So there are more complex methods of generating that, such as hashing or salting the end result. And in terms of storage on your database, you do want to make sure that that's encrypted in your system so that people can't just simply look it up easily. With respect to what we're going to look at today, we're going to implement some status codes that come back from our API based on whether or not someone is authorized. And in the broader scheme of things, there's a whole bunch of different status codes out there for HTTP. And there are 5 types. There's your 100 series, which are informational, which are just information at the transfer protocol level. 200 indicates a success on the request. There are different types of 200 successes. Some have a little more information. 300 redirection, so something is moved temporarily, permanently. It requires that the client do some sort of follow-up action to complete the request. The 400 series is the client did something wrong. They tried to access a resource that doesn't exist. You're a 404 error, or they didn't provide correct credentials. And then the 500 errors, which you never want to get, because that means you did something wrong because your server can't complete the request because something went wrong on your server. So we're going to be looking at 400 and some key status codes that you might remember from last time, but here they are again. 200 success, your API call was successful. Always return that if someone is called into your API and they're authorized and you send the data back that comes back with the 200. A 400 bad request means the request is incorrect in some way. That doesn't mean it's 404 not found. It means that the information you submitted was wrong. So a parameter was missing, or you specified something in a parameter that isn't a valid value. The 401 unauthorized typically indicates that authentication is required, but you didn't specify it. And then a 403 forbidden means you gave us your authentication information, or maybe you didn't, and you're just not allowed to view it. And 418, which I don't think anybody will be using here, is I'm a teapot. And that's typically issued when you try to brew coffee using a teapot. And you'll notice 404 isn't here because it's not found.
Oh, I see what you did there.
It was an accident last time, and I kept it in this time.
Okay. We all
So
know
previous,
404 errors. Yeah.
yeah. So we're going to continue working on an app that we started building last time back in December, and in that we generated and tested a a web service for our data. The data is coming from the sample Northwinds database, and we expose 3 tables, the customers, orders, and order details tables. We also created a component for handling generating an API key, and that component simply took an email address, you clicked a button, and then it generated a GUID, which had some extra information. It had curly braces and hyphens, which you may not want to keep. But that was done using just a simple UUID, a GUID. So today we're gonna go back and we're gonna clean up that key generation, and then I'm gonna show you how you can pass that key in as part of your call in the Alpha Anywhere web service system that we have, and then get it out and check it, and then say yes, 200, they are allowed to use this, or no, 401 credentials invalid. That's the end of our slideshow here. All right. So before I continue, did anybody have any questions about what you just mentioned? Otherwise, we're going to get into the moving forward.
Be helpful if I wasn't on mute. Yes, let's get on to the moving forward. We have a couple questions, but they're not directly related to that.
Okay.
Someone's asked for a link to the first part of this demo, the one in December. So I'll go dig that up in the background and put it in the chat window.
Yes,
Please.
highly recommend.
But please,
Yeah.
Sarah, carry on.
Carry. All right. So just as a quick visual reminder, this is what we built last time. We have a UX component, and in whatever framework you decide to deploy this kind of system, this component might be behind a login. We're not going to go that far as to build out like a whole complete system. I just want to show you guys how to get the authentication piece into your XBasic class that defines the service. But the way this worked is we entered an email address. Let's do Dave, example.com. We click this API key button. It executes this code, which we're going to walk through real briefly as a refresher. What this is it's an AJAX callback to this XBasic function we built called generate API key. And what it does is it opens this up. That's blocking my view. It gets the email that was entered here, so that comes back in the data submitted object on the function from Alpha Anywhere. We set that email into an argument, a SQL argument. We then look up in our web service table, which we'll look at after this, to see if any API key exists for that email address yet. In this case, it's going to come back blank because Dave doesn't exist in our system yet. And since it comes back blank, then we generate a key. We create a new record using this new record.email.api key, because we're going to use the SQL insert to add that into our keys table. So we step over that. And if we check result 2, we get no error, and it inserted that record into our table. And then if we run this, what we'll see is what was generated sent back to us. So I mentioned this briefly last time, that GUID create puts a few extra things in that key that maybe we don't want to keep. Maybe we probably don't want to keep the curly braces and hyphens and just stick to the alphanumeric characters. So we'll fix that here shortly. But if we come back over to our database, which I've already got running in DB Browse for SQLite, if we look at this table, and this is DB Browse for SQLite for looking at SQLite databases. That's how I've implemented this keys table. In a deployed environment, you're probably going to use something else like SQL Server or MariaDB. But this is just for demonstration purposes. But if we come over to browse data, there's our David example. There's our new API key. This was all created and set up. So what I'd like to do first before we move forward with showing how you can validate that the API key exists is to first clean up our data. So I don't want to store the curly braces and hyphens in here. So what we're going to do first before we move forward is delete all these records and save them. So our table is blank again, and come back to design and go over to the XBasic Functions tab, which is where our generate API key function lives. And here where we have our key GUID create, we're going to do one more thing with our key. We're going to say key equal rem special key. And rem special is an XBasic function that strips out all non-alphabetic and non-numeric characters from a string and removes spaces. So that will get rid of the extra characters in our key. And just to make this a little bit easier to read, I'm gonna make our API key box a bit wider. And we'll do Dave again. Generate API key. And if we just step down in here, if we look at our key now, see how it doesn't have any of those special symbols in it anymore. So we'll just run. There's our API key. And we'll just make another one here. So make one for me. And we'll run that. And there's mine. And if we check our data here, there's the updated values. So that's a bit cleaner. And I've mentioned this before, but if you're ever doing testing or you need like fake email addresses, example.com is a great resource to use. It's the universal website placeholder solely for example code and testing and stuff. You can't send emails to it, but it's nice for demos like this. So let's save that. Excuse me. And we're all set there. That's going to generate our API key. Again, I mentioned there are more complicated ways to generate these things, but we're just going to keep it that simple example. And now we're going to go back to our web service and just take a quick look at what that is. We created customer demo, and if we edit this, it has 3 exposed methods: customers select, order details select, and then orders select. And these are all post operations. You post something, a query string, and it sends back some data. And if you look here, they are all authenticated because we have turned on require authentication for selected methods. But just as a reminder, let's create a test page. No, let's not do that.
Oh, so that brings up an interesting point. You can decide that some of the methods aren't authenticated and are just publicly exposed, all in the same class if you wanted to. That's what it sounds like.
Yeah, so here you come in here and you define the authentication methods and
Oh, and there can be different methods for each one.
the
Oh, neat.
method name, and then
Yeah.
down here, I think if we edit this guy,
Mhm.
down here there's a checkbox for authenticated. So this is customer select. And it's like, yeah, we're gonna authenticate it, and we're gonna call this method.
Mhm.
And here you can define your response code. So we could insert a sample. 200 successful request, 401 denied, 500 server didn't respond. These are just shown in the Swagger API test documentation. What actually gets returned, that's dictated by your XBasic implementation.
Cool.
But yes, I think initially when this is set up, these are not authenticated. So I think I might have jumped ahead on you a little bit, but initially when these are exposed, that's turned off. So let's turn those off real quick. So there's a little lock icon here. If it's swung open, it means it's not authenticated. So anybody who calls it isn't going to, they don't have to have an API key or anything. Alpha Anywhere is just going to return the request. But if you want to turn that on, you can say this is authenticated, and then you can come in here and select what that authentication method is. Now we generated this service using the web service Genie for SQL tables, and that Genie generates all these placeholder methods for you if it's something you want to enable. So we're going to come in here and just reset those back up for select orders. You know, let's just look at customers select and leave the other ones alone. And then we'll save it. And show live test the API. That's the button I've been looking for. Okay. Oh, and I just need to figure out how to peel this off of my browser tabs. There we go. So this is a Swagger test page. The API web service Genie within Alpha Anywhere will generate this for you. And Swagger is just a description, a language for describing a web service. And in this test page, you can open up these little sections to see examples of executing your query. So if we wanted to test out our customers here, we could say try it out. And then here in this block here, we want to do a query. So we don't need all these fields. But maybe we want, I don't think we need to define fields, but we can say where. So we can say where a country equals Spain. And I believe if we execute this now, no such column Spain. Hold up. I apologize.
Is this a single quote situation?
This always happens. I assume something. Do we need? Oh, yes. Thank you. There we go. I have to quote Spain because it's a string. Okay.
Yeah, otherwise it's saying, does the country equal some field name Spain?
Equal some field name. Thank you, Dave.
Yeah.
So here's the result, and you'll notice it didn't like, well, it's not going to authenticate anything because we haven't implemented that in our authentication function, and by default the function always returns 200. But that's here in this body is, you know, this is where you specify the query parameters for that lookup. When you turn on authentication, you can come in here and you can set authorization, so API key authorization for the customer select, the order select, and the order details. So we're going to close this and we're going to come back here. And we're going to come, the function that was set up for this, that's configured for you, is this customer select authenticate.
Can we take a look at it? See what
we're going to go take a look at that. Yeah. So all that lives in an XBasic class. And it's called SQL CRUD customer demo. It's up here. And there's this little link, and you say click edit class. It opens up the editor for that XBasic class. We're not going to do that here, though. We're going to, hold on. We're going to save that. I'm going to go all files. And here it is, SQL CRUD customer demo XBasic class. Well, A5XB class. And this is everything that was generated to make those API calls work. It's implemented through XBasic. And the function we'd like to work with today is the one for the customer authentication. So some of you know about this. Most of you, I think, don't know about it, but there's a bunch of functions in here in this XBasic editor. And down here is the little drop down. And you can use this to quickly jump to a function if you already know what you're looking for. And we're looking for customer select authenticate. and this is the function. And it's got a bunch of helpful information in here.
And was this put in automatically by Alpha Anywhere, this
This is
code as
all
well?
generated automatically from
When you use the
first
Genie
created it. Yep, when we created
okay,
the Genie.
great,
Otherwise, it's on you to implement that.
sure.
But you'll see here that it says customer select authenticate equals 200. So when this function gets called, regardless of an API key being specified or not, it's always returning 200, meaning the authentication is valid. So this is the point where you need to start doing the work to implement the authentication piece, because we don't know where you stored it. We don't know what type of method you're using. And we don't know if you've created fine-grained control down to like, you have access to this call, but you don't have access to that call. So this is the part where it's the handoff is to you, and at this point, it's up to you to implement this.
Could you write like just right now, just like a really simple if then, just to say, if the
Yeah,
API
so
equals
we're
something?
gonna start basically first by proving we can make this work,
Okay.
and we're gonna create just a static API key. And we're gonna call it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. And then we're gonna say if our API key, which is passed in here, is equal to test key, then we're gonna return 200. And 200 means success. You're
Now
allowed
you
to
use
access it.
an equals, which is not always typical in XBasic. Could you also get away with an equal in this case?
I think it's supported.
Oh yeah, I think it is too.
I'm pretty sure it's supported.
Yep.
I think XBasic lets you do this, and
And a lot of other programming
that
languages
looks
don't.
like an assignment to me, and I don't like it.
Because if you do that in JavaScript, it's not going to work, or in Python, it's not going to work. Yeah.
Well,
So
yeah,
yeah,
even in those languages, a single equal
yeah.
sign tends to be
Assignment. Yeah, I know what you mean.
assignment. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I will quickly.
Is it helpful having me sort of second guess your code as you're typing it in here, or would you like me to be quiet? Sorry about
No,
that.
it's a good question to
All
ask.
right. Yeah.
And that since you've brought it up, I'm gonna throw it in the chat where you can go look up this. There
Oh, okay,
is a
great. Thank you.
difference between the two. So
Exactly equals or
yeah. So in the case of the single equal, I'm just gonna pull this over here. So in the single equal operator in XBasic, something like capital folly space is equal to lowercase folly with a bunch of extra spaces after it, which in my mind is not what I wanted. So the exactly matching operator, which is the double equal, will return false in that case.
Yep.
So this is what we want anyway. So if the API key that was passed in is equal to our test key, we return 200, else return 401. And if you have questions about how API key gets passed into here, we need to find where this is called. So we'll find that guy. We'll search backwards. We won't search at all.
Look,
It's
it
not
looks
called
like
in here. I think
it
it's
gets
called somewhere
it's called
else.
directly by the endpoint though, isn't it?
Called directly by the endpoint. You are correct. Right. But there was something important about it. So let's save that. There's our authenticate. And let's go, customer select is right here, which calls select generic. There was a piece of information somewhere that explained where the API key was passed in. but it must be back here in our web service. Let's cancel this. Let's just go live test our API. So here's our customer select. At this point, authorization isn't on. We did change the validation. So there we go. We've added the validation piece. We didn't pass in an API key, so we're getting a 401 response code error, unauthorized, back, which is exactly what we want. Now, if we wanted to test authentication against this, we would come up here, we would paste our API key in that we're using, click authorize, go ahead and close that, and then execute it again. And this time we get a 200 because we had the right API key. If we specified something else, like 0987654321, which is an API key, but is the wrong one, and execute that, we get our 401 error. So that's against the static known key.
So can you also, okay, so can you walk through that just a little bit more? Are you making two different calls, one to first authenticate and then the other to make the request?
That's a good question. But the answer is no.
Okay,
The API key is actually being passed in right here as a URL parameter.
I see.
And that's how it gets passed in using what we've built here.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's just question mark API key equals that. All right. This piece up here just
Yeah,
sort of
what are the
simplifies.
authorizations for?
Yeah, this is where you specify that API key if you want to test this with the authorization on. If you don't have that there, you have to manually include it.
Oh, I see it by typing it into,
Yeah,
okay.
into the parameters. But you'll notice here, the only thing we've given you access to is body.
Mm-hmm.
And I do not. We can try it here. Oops. But I do not believe this is going to pick up that API key in our test. Yeah, so it's not going to read it out of the body. It has
Would
to
that
come
be
into
a
the header.
single quote though around that again? I don't know, just for comparison.
No,
Okay.
no, because the body is name value pairs. So where is the name of a value, and the value is
Yeah,
a
that makes sense.
search
Yeah.
query. An API key is the name of the value, which is
Mm-hmm.
this. So yeah, so that is a limitation.
So it doesn't get posted into the body. It must get posted into what, the
No,
head?
it's in the URL parameters, which is why you need to specify it up here.
Mm-hmm.
There we go. Knowing that though, you could take this URL here, because this is running in live preview, and you can test it this way as well.
Yeah.
Which isn't going to give me anything back because I didn't pass in a body.
Right. Although you might get a response back in your console, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I get nothing back.
You get a blank.
Yeah. because that came back in the response body, which is JSON.
Yep.
So.
Very cool.
All right. I'm hoping I'm confusing everyone thoroughly right now.
No, I don't think so.
I don't think so either. Because we're still just doing live test. All right. And this for some reason added these again, but okay. Go ahead and close that. So what we would like to do in that authenticate is, rather than using a test key, which this is just getting you to the point where you can validate that your logic is correct. So like initially when I was setting this up, all these examples show something like the name of the function equals and a value or a function call. I like to use the return keyword. This here, the setting the function name equal to some value, is the same as using the return keyword. But I kept saying return equals, and that was not working. So what we like to do now, though, is take our API key, do a SQL lookup, and decide if that's valid, if we find it or not. And I have the SQL lookup function handily here. But what I'm going to do actually is come back over here to my xbasic function and copy this guy instead, because I like to work from working code.
Yep.
And paste this here, and instead of email, we're going to do API key. And instead of saying email, because email will say API key equal to API key. And this will either return nothing if it doesn't exist, or will give us back the API key from the database. We'll just
So
keep
the SQL lookup is going against a
web
table
service
called web service.
Yes.
And that table,
and I was, yeah,
right?
which is this guy here.
Yes, exactly.
And
that table happens to have two things in it. One is called keys and one is called email, I think, or
has
something else.
API keys and email in it.
Yep.
If we go and look at our AlphaDio connection strings, this is web services, the connection string I built for it. And if we just, I don't think will Explorer will do it. Yeah. So we click Explore and expand it. There's our keys table, and it has email, API key, and then some other information that you might want to capture or
like whether or not
use
it's
to restrict,
expired.
like
Yep.
scope, like do you have access to orders or just customers or both or none? When does it expire? Is it expired? Yes, no. When did you create it? When was it last modified? The created probably should be something that gets inserted in the database by your database and not something that you send from your code. And then last modified, when was this edited? Like if it expired, last modified would be like, when was that expired basically? Might not be something worth keeping around, but that's what's in there. So those are just some ideas of what you might want to store in there. But yeah, we're going to look up in the keys table whether or not the API key exists, and down here, if result is not equal to nothing, and we basically do the return 200. Otherwise, we return 401. And I don't need test key anymore, but I'll leave it there. And just for folks who need the reference, here's SQL Lookup.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
Yeah. And what it returns is the value you request in the results expression, which is this value here, API key. That's the result expression. What do you want back? And then args is the definition of the SQL argument values that you used in either the filter or basically in the filter. And that's this thing here, :API key. That's a SQL argument. Always use SQL arguments when you're making queries against your database, either using the SQL Lookup function or the SQL namespace methods. It protects you from things like SQL injection attacks, which if you're only using server-side scripts, maybe you don't think that's a big deal, but we're working with information coming from the client. We have no idea where they're going to send an API key. They could send anything. There's no data validation on that. So always use SQL arguments just to keep yourself safe, keep your data sanitized. So API key comes in, we set it here, we do a lookup. If nothing gets returned, if that's blank, then, or sorry, if something is returned, if it's not blank, then they're authorized. We found the record, otherwise it's 401. Not found, not authorized. So let's save that. And we're gonna come over here and we're just gonna copy Dave's API key out of here and come back over here and go to our service and do a live test again.
Should we try it with a bad API key first?
Yeah, let's try it with our original one, our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. And that's just to validate that this is updated. Sometimes.
That's a point.
Yeah, so we'll try it out.
Something got cached, right? Exactly.
Yeah, something got cached, and we'll go country equals Spain. I'm gonna get rid of all this other stuff. I don't need it. I'm gonna execute it. And we have 401 auth unauthorized, not allowed.
That's what we want.
That's what we want. So now, moment of truth. If we use an API key, we know it's authorized. Just to validate, execute that. And there's a 200 response code. Dave's allowed to access our data. So that's how you get started. This is very simple, very basic. There's a lot of effort that you'll have to put in to building your own web service with Alpha Anywhere. As you can see, this is certainly not a no-code solution. But with respect to wanting to expose something from a database or a system of record that you have, using that SQL Genie will get you all of this. And then the API key format of passing API key on the URL gets you to this point where you can add that authentication in. So do I have any questions?
The authentication piece here is created by the Genie when you tell Alpha Anywhere that you want to create a REST service to expose to a SQL data source. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
And if
can it be added to another, like let's say you weren't exposing a SQL data source, you just had your own REST API, but you wanted to do authentication. Is there maybe a way to copy that code or reuse that code?
Yeah, so if you're starting from nothing,
yeah,
which I didn't talk through this, I should have talked through this. If you have web services selected, there's this option here to create a new REST service. And we went through this, use Genie to create REST service to expose database tables.
And that's what wrote all that code that we saw.
That's what generated all of our code. But you can start with an empty service.
Yep.
And you can add a new class if you have one. If you don't have one, you have to make one. And I'm just going to show you how to do that real quick. So let's go this empty. We'll just call it empty. Yep, can't generate the Swagger definition because it has no class. But if we go over to XBasic here and click new, there's an option to create a new XBasic class. And up here in the insert menu, if you've got your, make sure to click inside of it somewhere, probably at the end, you can insert a class definition for a REST API. And this has a sample method supplied with 2 arguments, and then it has some errors that you can return. And this is where you can start. In terms of passing in the API, I believe arguments to this function are passed in as URL parameters, but let's not assume that. Let's save this as
Well, on a post, wouldn't that be sent in the body, I believe, right? As opposed to as part of the query string.
yeah, I just got an error message, but I didn't read it. Yeah, there are a bunch of different ways you can pass in the. Let's go back to our empty web service here and add our my namespace sample class.
Mhm.
Here's our method. Here are the arguments for the method. You edit the method properties. We have to expose it. What type is it? Is it a get? Is it a post? Is it a delete? Are you updating data? Put patch. This stuff you'll need to Google it. But you can map the arguments passed in as query parameters that come in. So there's a default here, arg1 and arg2. That's going to match what our xBasic class is. But these are passed into arguments for the function.
Oh, so you can kind of rename them if you wanted to on the
Yeah.
way in. Neat.
I'm just going to save this real quick and go look at the other xBasic class for the SQL CRUD and look at our customers select, because that calls select generic. And it looks like everything gets passed in here. The table, the fields, the order. The piece that my knowledge is a bit weak on is how do we map that in? And that's probably defined here. Arguments body. All right, arguments are passed in the body.
Yep.
And this is it URL, is it JSON encoded or form encoded? Okay, so on our other service, if you wanted to pass that stuff in on the body,
You'd make it a post, first of all, right?
you'd have to make it a post.
Uh-huh.
And then it's passed in on the body. That's the piece I was missing. Okay. So post lets you pass in data in the body. You can also pass in data on the header. So maybe you have arg1. Argument arg1. These are the method arguments. So if you wanted to map that method argument arg1 to a value on a header, the header variable name is arg1, then it would read that header value out. So that actually, let's not say that. Let's come over here. So you notice that our API key was being passed in on the URL parameter.
Mm-hmm.
If we build it here, I'm wondering if we can put API key here. We cannot. All right. So that's still happening somewhere else. So you might need to do a bit of extra work to get that API key passed in a different way.
Being passed in the body is probably okay, though, presumably.
Header. There we go. It's the answer sitting right in front of me. When you
Okay.
configure authentication methods, argument, query string, or header. These are your two options.
There we go.
Header is better because
Header is, you're
it's
not going
not
to
going to
see
get
it.
logged. It's not going to be seen in your URL traffic. We default to query string because that's pretty simple and easy to understand. Headers starts to remove things from what you can see on the screen easily. But here's where you can change that to be passed in the header instead of the,
Oh, fantastic.
yeah. And then if you wanted to call like API key, argument, API key, click OK, OK, save that. I'll live test it. We come down here. And I apologize, my mind has wandered all over the place, and I've forgotten the original question, but I do want to make sure that I answered it.
Yeah, the original question is how would you add this type of authentication code if you weren't using the Genie?
Yeah. So you would define the function that does the authentication.
Mm-hmm.
You would, let's go back that. I'll kill this guy. So in your XBasic class that implements the service,
Mm-hmm.
you would define an authentication function. So like, and it has to be inside this end class thing. Function myauth as C, key is C, key equals, I think we defaulted to nothing in case somebody
Mm-hmm.
calls it, right? And then end function. And this needs to return whether or not you're authorized. We'll just return 200 for now. So you specify that, and this all your authentication magic when it gets passed in your I've got this open 1,000 times. In your web service, on your method, you would say it's authentication, and you would say, well, it looks like you have to add and require authentication. Define your authentication methods. My auth was the one I added. I'm gonna pass in, let's see here, it's this guy specified in there. The method name is my auth. Let's pass it on the header. We'll call it API key. And the argument is that key
Mm-hmm.
argument for the function. Now keep in mind, if you go in and change that later, that parameter on the function, you got to update this. Okay. So you set that up, and then you come back to your method, your get method, right? And then you say it is authentication, and you have to use my auth, and that's how you get it set up. So that's how you add it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That was a really good run through, actually, of how to get
Yeah.
that set up. Cool.
Yes.
This
So
will be
that's there.
this will be the 3 minutes we publish later on. But
Yeah, this is ship it.
fantastic. Oh, this is great. Yeah, ship it exactly.
Ship it.
Cool.
Yeah, that's how you can add it. The logic to authenticate, that can be whatever you want it to be. Keep in mind, if you're going there out of API keys or auth or any of those other options that may require third-party services, you have to provide a way for people to generate that. So
Terrific.
anyway, let's save that. And then we were back here. I was live testing this again, where country equal Spain. I just wanted to see if it was all right. Passed it on the header. So that time it was. So if you see here, the API key is no longer on the URL.
Yep.
But we do have this -h API key : thing. That's -h is header. So this is a curl call to do the post, but that's where that gets set. And then here's the response 200. I simplified what data was getting sent back by specifying that we only wanted the customer ID.
Right. Yep.
Mm.
That is awesome.
Yeah.
Very much. So
So
we've got about, I don't know, 3 or 4 minutes left. I was
Mhm.
hoping maybe we can get to a couple of questions here.
for sure.
Yep. So the questions about this we covered as we went along. So these will be a little bit different questions.
Oh,
The
good.
first one will be, this is a good one. Is there a way to execute JavaScript from an XBasic function that's not part of an event handler? Like, is there actually a command in XBasic for executing JavaScript? I believe the answer is yes.
So I know you can run Node,
Mhm.
Node services, but are
So
they
that'd
just
be a
wanting
way
to
of doing it.
execute JavaScript within
Mhm.
XBasic or
Within
return
X,
JavaScript from XBasic to execute?
well, returning JavaScript from XBasic to execute would be sounds like an AJAX callback, which would be
Right.
called from something on the browser side, which would by definition be an event, right? Something had occurred,
Right.
even for a timer. So I'm presuming that they want to run it for some reason inside, maybe to get a value back out of it. I don't know.
Perhaps. So just upon a quick Google quick search in documentation, we do have a function called xbasic execute JavaScript.
Yep. There you go.
It has an option to sandbox it,
Mhm.
which will,
And open a console window as well. Well, that's kind of interesting.
yeah. So keep in mind, this open a console window thing is only going to work in the developer environment. You can't do that up on the server because the console window will open on the server, and
That
presumably
might,
you're running a web or mobile application, which has no access to that.
that might be what they're looking for, because the next question is it possible to use a third-party product to debug JavaScript code?
Yeah, in fact, you have to use a third-party product to debug JavaScript code
Okay. Are there any in
because
particular that you like
we
using?
use the Chrome debugger within
Hmm.
Alpha Anywhere itself. So if we're in live preview, this is actually running inside of a browser emulator
Right.
maintained by someone else. And open the Chrome debugger. This is the thing I use that we encourage people to use to debug their JavaScript. You can open this here if you're on a browser already, like this one. There are options, Control D? No.
For developer tools? I don't
So
know.
this is Edge, and if I hit F12, it opens up the developer tools. Chrome has a different hotkey, but if I open up a
But
new
Chrome,
window,
Firefox, and Edge all have
yeah,
debuggers built
they
into
all
them.
have them. Yeah, so uh, here's Chrome. Um, if you click the three dots here, there's this more tools, Control Shift I, developer tools. This is also the Chrome debugger. This console, it shows you output from your page, but you can also do things in it, like alerts and any JavaScript really. It can also call functions in your app that are already implemented. So you can use this.
Nice. Can
Yeah.
you read the value of variables and things like that? Or I guess
Yeah.
it's neat.
Yeah, for sure. I don't have a, let's just go run this guy here. Let's just execute it in Firefox.
Okay.
And I do believe we have a video that was released in recent history, so within the last 5 years, on F12 to open it in Firefox.
Mhm.
But here's this app running in Firefox. You've got access to the console, the inspector, where you can look at how everything's are generated. Let me know if this dark mode thing is unreadable, and I will not use it in the future. But there's a picker tool here. Um, let's see here. Console debugger, live preview, JavaScript. So the debugger tab is where you can find JavaScript in Firefox, and this is everything that we include, which is unreadable. But there's a pretty print source button you can click that formats it all, makes it a little bit easier to look at.
Of course, the gigantic files is probably going to take a minute to format that.
Yeah, I'll take a minute, a hot minute.
Yeah. Oh, not
But
bad,
once
not
it's
bad.
formatted, it adds in color coding for you too, so you can see
Yeah.
that. There's a DLG is the precursor for the UX component, that curly brace dialog.object. It gets
Hmm.
a name when it's running, and in this case, it's DLG1 underbar dialog object because I just launched this UX component straight into the browser. But if it's embedded on a page, it's going to have a name. But you can call the methods on this thing like get value and then email, and it returns nothing. But if I put in here like, oops, why are we breaking? Resume. I have a breakpoint open. Where are my breakpoints? Why do I have a breakpoint? Must have been doing something earlier. Example.com. So now there's a value in there, and if I press the up arrow on the console window, it retrieves, it goes up backwards through the history of things you've written.
Yep.
So now if I do get value, there's that Sarah at example.com.
Cool.
Yeah, you can use this to test CSS styles as well. I've used up all the time though talking about this.
We are at the end of the time. Sarah, thank you very much for presenting. Thank you everyone for showing up today and for asking such great questions. If you do have more questions, of course, you can send them to guides, GUIDES at alphasoftware.com. We hope to see you at next Wednesday's webinar. Until then, take care and stay well. Bye-bye.